and we can start.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Centre for Publishing seminar. And I'm pleased to welcome Richard Charkin to talk about my back pages in publishing. So, Richard, take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Simon. So this is a book. I've been a publisher for 50 odd years, and I've never written a book. So it was a bit of a surprise that I've become an author. I've crossed that divide in some way or other, although I still remain a publisher. It started, there are many beginnings for a book. One form is that a publisher rings up a potential author and says, I think it would be really great to have a book about the Second World War come out for the 80th anniversary of the end of it. Or sometimes someone sits in a cell and writes the novel that's going to change the world, and then a literary agent submits it, and publishers may or may not decide to publish it. Those are the two main ways books arrive. This one arrived a different way. For quite a few years now, I've given talks at courses like the publishing course, the MA course at UCL or at City University or at Oxford Brookes, about my career, but more importantly, about the sort of changes that have happened in publishing over what has been a fairly tumultuous half-century. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, the head of the course, or indeed one or two students, might come up and say, why don't you write it up? It would make an interesting book. And I had a very clear answer to those questions, which was no. I think the world doesn't need another self-serving memoir by an overpaid executive publisher. One. Two, I'm too lazy. And three, I've forgotten most of the good stories. Those would seem pretty good reasons, but a friend of mine that I've known since he was very young, a guy called Tom Campbell, who's a novelist, came up and said, you know, I'd like to help you write this book. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. However, we sat down together for a couple of hours where I told a little bit of the story of how it all began and stuff like that. And it was quite fun for me. For him, it was hard work. He had to try and keep notes and write stuff, and then I'd edit it. Anyway, we didn't know whether we were going to have it published. It didn't matter. The process was the process. But in the back of my mind was the idea that it might be helpful to people coming into the industry for the first time, and perhaps even for people who are already in the industry, who might get some benefit out of a broader description of what publishing is and means, and where it's been and where it might go. At the end of about 6 months of these meetings, which are either in the coffee house in Newington Green or in the Working Man's Club there, the latter with beers, the former with coffees, we had 60,000 words. And before committing to publishing it or doing anything, I insisted on sending it out to referees. I believe in peer review. And the referees came back and they were all, critical of parts. Nearly everyone who knew about one part was critical and gave me lots of good ideas for improving it. But overall, they all seemed to like the book as a whole. And then one of them, a guy called Francis Bennett, who was the founder of Book Data, which is the basis of all our metadata in the industry today, the Nielsen book scan, all those information stuff. I sent it to him to see if I'd got wrong any of the things relating to metadata. He came back and said, well, I don't know. I don't think you've got it very wrong, but can I publish it? I've started a small publishing house. So I said yes. And, 20 minutes later, there was a contract and we signed it. And I think 2 months later, we published the book in time for the London Book Fair this year. So that's how it came about. And I think throughout it, I've tried to keep in mind you lot, students and professionals in the world of publishing, and particularly those in universities, because that's the next generation of people who are coming through. So I'll try. Oh, incidentally, I'd like to say, cut in at any point with any questions, any clarifications. It's completely fine. There is a risk in any of these things that you use some jargon or some words that have one meaning and have another meaning somewhere else. So do feel free to ask. And indeed, if you'd like to comment and criticize, that's equally welcome. We won't do it at the end. Let's do it as we keep going, because there's a hard end at 10 to 2 to let you go to your next session. So I'll start at the beginning. When we started writing this book, we had in mind trying to track change. And so if I describe my first job and the environment, it may help just to give some context. It was at the end of 1971, that's a long time ago, that I was out of a job and wanted to be a journalist. I had written one piece that Sunday Times had published, and I'd been paid, I think it was £10 for 3 months' work. Even in those days, £10 for 3 months' work was pretty poor pay. I asked the editor at the Sunday Times how I could get the pay increased a bit. He said, well, join the National Union of Journalists. How do I do that? Well, you'd have to write another 6 or 7 pieces like that, or go and work on births, deaths, and marriages on a provincial newspaper somewhere, neither of which seemed very attractive. Or, he said, apply, get a job in book publishing, and they're desperate to hire and recruit more people in book publishing, and you'll get one straight away. So I wrote off to, I think, 50, because at the time there were indeed 50 independent book publishers in London. I don't know what the number is today, but I don't think it's 50. And each of them had to do a letter and a stamp and an address. I got three responses. All 3 were from family-owned businesses, none of which exist today as they were. The first one was from a chap called Mark Collins, and Collins was the name of his company. That wasn't entirely a surprise. And it's now HarperCollins, obviously, and it's part of News International and etc. He said, no, thank you very much, after meeting me. And the second one was Philip Attenborough, who was of the Attenborough family who owned Hodder and Stoughton, which is now part of Hachette. He also said no. The third one was a company called Harrop, owned by the Harrop family, and they were desperate, obviously, to find someone who knew something about science, and I had a science degree. So they just hired me as commissioning editor. It was madness. But there I was living in a basement flat in South Kensington, which is inconceivable today. Even it was really rotten, but even so, it would be very expensive today to live in South Kensington. I drove to work in my minivan and parked in High Holborn. This is equally inconceivable, but that was what it was. The building was 182 High Holborn, and the whole building was George G. Harrop and Son Publishers. About 60, 70 people working there, and everything was there. There were the editors, the production people, the marketing people, the sales people, etc. Most remarkably, the warehouse was there as well, on the ground floor, and that's where we kept all our stock. Anyway, I arrived, and on day one, someone from the production department said, "You're the new science editor. We're about to print a revision guide to mathematics, volume 1. How many shall we print?" I said, "I don't know. How many shall I? I don't know." He said, "Well, aren't you the science editor? That's your job." "All right. Well, 10,000? Does that seem okay?" "Yes," he said. "Fine." I suspect there's still 9,980 lurking in some corners of some warehouse somewhere in the world. Anyway, that was my first day, and why I mention this is to contrast it with today. There are very few smallish family businesses. It was entirely, the board was entirely male and obviously white. The main directors were all called Harrop, so there was no point us addressing them as Mr. Harrop. So there was Mr. Paul and Mr. Ian and Mr. this and Mr. Malcolm and what have you. The most senior woman in the company was the number 2 in publicity. There was no HR department. Clearly, there was no IT department because there was no IT. There was a lot of carbon paper, if you know what carbon paper is, which was used to keep copies. And there were pigeonholes where your post arrived, and you took your post out and you dealt with it. Strangely, you got the letter in the morning, you had it typed over lunchtime, and you sent it in the afternoon, and it got there the following day because the Royal Mail worked. It was probably almost as quick as an email, but rather more expensive, rather more effort in a way. Anyway, so if you can picture this, this was also during the time of the 3-day week, when the miners were on strike and there was not enough energy. And so there were days when you were working by candlelight. This could well have been the 19th century, for all I knew. But speaking personally, it was a fantastic apprenticeship, and so much harder today for anyone to be exposed to the whole business. There was no working from home, obviously, so everyone went in every day. In my case particularly, as I was the science editor and no one really gave a damn about science, it was mainly literature and things like that got them excited. So I had to do my own publicity effectively, had to sell my own rights. I took myself off to the Frankfurt Book Fair. I didn't ask anyone because there was no one really to ask, so you just went. And I had to learn everything. If you wanted to know what the sales figures of a book were, it was quite a convoluted process. You first of all went to the production department and said, "How many did we print?" You then went to the publicity department and said, "How many did we give away?" And then you'd go down to the warehouse and say, "How many have we got left?" Simple arithmetic gave you the sales figures. Didn't tell you how much money or anything like that, but at least you got the number of copies that apparently had gone out. Well, it's different now. It's different in every way. And so leaving the 19th century behind, which was Harrop, which I might say, incidentally, has been blown to all four quarters of the world. It was acquired by someone and then who sold off the bits and pieces. The children's went somewhere, the science went somewhere else. The dictionaries, which was a big part of their business, the French dictionary in particular, went somewhere else, and never to be seen again, really. Shame. Well, it's a shame. It's life. It's the way of the world. So there was also at that time something called wage restraint. It was a Labour government who thought the way to stop inflation was to not allow people to have pay rises. So the only way to get a pay rise was to get another job. So I just had my first child. My wife had just had our first child, and we were broke and needed a pay rise, and also couldn't afford to live in London anymore. So I applied for a job in Oxford at a company called Pergamon Press, which was a science publisher, largely journals. And arriving there, I was greeted by the owner and ogre. He was a man called Robert Maxwell. If you do any research on him, you will discover he was one of the nastiest people in our industry. On the other hand, he was a brilliant publisher. And he built Pergamon Press into being the world's leading scientific publisher. If you do any research, there's a big company in the publishing company in the United Kingdom called RELX, R-E-L-X, which is, I think, the biggest or the most profitable publisher in the world, bar none. And much of their fortune comes from the fact they bought this company, Pergamon Press. And it was at Pergamon where computers started to come into the business. Not computers as we know it today, but mainframe computers that were churning out invoices and such like. More to the point, it was professionalizing itself, or trying to. So there were departments. There was an HR department. There was a very strong union, of which I was what was called the father of the chapel, the main union pain in the neck for the management. And we were very, very commercial. So, for instance, one day, Robert Maxwell came in and said, I think the pound is very weak and is going to become weaker. So we are now going to bill everyone in dollars, wherever they are in the world, which included Blackwell's in Oxford, who resisted, but eventually gave in. And then 3 months later, he said, oh no, actually, the Swiss franc is the currency we want to be. And so we started billing everyone in Swiss francs. This was all about trying to maximize profit. The other technology that was coming through was what was called photo typesetting, where instead of movable type and bits of metal, there was photo typesetting. And then one day he came in with this fantastic idea. If you're photo typesetting something, if you twist the lens a bit, you can get more words on a line. And if you get more words on a line, you can get more words on a page. And if you get more words on a page, you'll have fewer pages. And therefore you will save money on the paper cost. Well, it made them fairly unreadable, but that's by the way. Anyway, after about 8 months, as I was in this position of the union, and I mention the union because it's another one of the big changes. Back then, unions were very, very powerful. They may be coming back a bit, but significantly less powerful than they are today. One day Maxwell was running to be a member of parliament for the Labour Party. And he instructed all staff and there were about 200 or 300 of us, to get on coaches that he'd laid on that would take them to the constituency where he was standing to canvass on his behalf. I went to see him and said, I think it's fine if people wish to canvass for you, but I don't think you can make it mandatory. He said, well, Richard, I thought you had a good future here. You clearly don't. And that was the end of my stay at Pergamon, but I had learnt a hell of a lot. And I joined Oxford University Press. Very different cup of tea. With a very strong culture of quality, very strong culture of quality and of globalism. Strong subsidiaries in North America, in Asia, in India in particular, in Australasia, and throughout Africa. Very white, very male still. And it's hard for you to believe this today, but was actually losing money hand over fist and was close to going broke because they had not adapted. And one of the themes of my book, I hope, is that the publishing industry has had to adapt and adapt quickly. And OUP was in exactly that position. And fortunately, we had a CEO. He was an academic, an economist by training, knew nothing about publishing, but he knew enough to know what he didn't know. And he made it possible, he delegated, he made it possible for the next generation, of which I was fortunately one, to take some chances and try to build a better business. And I think actually we succeeded, and it's still going on to this day. The chances we took were, for instance, we had to close the printing works. A printing works in the centre of Oxford simply made no sense. We transferred typesetting to India, which at the time was quite radical. The idea that Indian people could typeset as well as trained people in Oxford was, counterintuitive. We had to close. We had a warehouse in London with 700 people on the payroll. It turns out that 200 never existed. They were called Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and it was a scam. We had to close it and build a completely new warehouse elsewhere, start again. But perhaps the most significant thing that happened was the emergence of digital publishing at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And I mean, 5 years before, they wouldn't know what an electron was, and suddenly there it was. And we were very lucky at OUP in that we had very large, and still do, very large catalogue of reference works. And reference works were the natural things to be digitized. And the most natural of all was the Oxford English Dictionary, which you can see behind me, I think. Well, no, anyway, I don't know whether you can see it, but that's the last print edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. We had enormous fun converting the original 12 volumes, a supplement of 1 volume, and then a further 4 supplements. We had to integrate them and, well, first of all, digitize them, then write software to integrate them. It was an incredible project, which has been well covered elsewhere, but I cover it a bit in the book, and I was quite central in it, really. And we had turned an old print product into a digital resource, which to this day is both incredibly helpful and scholarly and useful and profitable. And I put the profitability thing there because publishing sometimes loses its way in getting this balance between scholarship or creativity or whatever and staying in business. And my career has been about staying in business as far as one can, but not forgetting that there are other aspects of the business. So we had to fight, and one of the messages is that taking chances is not necessarily easy. First of all, you've got to take a chance. You know, it makes you nervous. But also, there are millions of people, millions. There are plenty of people who will be obstacles to whatever you want to challenge. So, for instance, with the OED, the professor of English literature at Oxford tried to stop the digitization of the OED on the grounds that if we were to do a new edition, we should revisit every citation in the OED, of which there are something like, I don't know, 300,000, to check that they were indeed valid and the rest of it. Well, of course, had we done that, the new edition would still not be available. So we had to get over all him. The other complaint was actually from the finance side. One of the guys said, but surely if we turn these thing into electrons, people will steal the information and we will have lost our greatest single asset. Well, the answer to that was, well, yes, it's possible, of course. But actually, the original OED was published in 1928, and this was in the days when copyright ran for 50 years, not the current 70. And this was the year 1978. So if we didn't do something with it, we were actually at the mercy of anyone printing it themselves. So whatever it was we were doing was better than not doing nothing, which is often the case. So anyway, it happened. I won't bore you with the details. Read it. I didn't get the top job there, and this is advice for people in their careers. If you don't get a promotion or whatever, you have really only two choices. Either you shut up and get on with your job, or you get out. Sulking is really boring for everyone, including you, so don't do it. So I didn't get the top job, so I rang up a chap who'd been mentoring me, a guy called Paul Hamlin, who was the inventor of affordable illustrated books in the 70s, and said, now's the time, can I? And he said, yeah, fine, I've just sold my business, but I'm sure they'll be happy to. So suddenly I was out of the sort of scholarly world of OUP into the mad world of I was given the job of starting from scratch a mass market paperback publishing house. I knew almost nothing about that. I've known almost nothing about everything I've ever got into. So I'm not sure you should take my advice on anything. But anyway, there I was, and given this task. And, well, you know, you're paid to do a job, so you better find out how to do it fairly quickly. I got very lucky, as usual, as often happens, not always. And the first book we published, it's a mass market paperback, by sheer chance, was called The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, which sold about 3 or 4 million copies in our edition. So that was a good start. Things didn't always work out like that, I assure you. Anyway, I worked my way up what was a very different culture from OUP. The OUP culture was about quality. The what was Reed International at the time was a public company on the London Stock Exchange. There was only one thing that mattered, which was the quarterly profit. And you had to meet that profit target, whatever it was. And no one really cared if you published lousy books. No one really got terribly excited if you published great books. It was about the bottom line. And, well, I learned a lot about the bottom line. And what I can say to you is that I'm not an accountant, and I couldn't be an accountant. But it's very important to understand accounting, at least in the same way that it's important to know how to ride a bicycle. It's just important, and you should, because we are a business. And some of the biggest mistakes I've made are when I've forgotten to do the sums properly. So I learned a lot about accountancy. Reed International then merged with a Dutch company called Elsevier to create a new conglomerate called Reed Elsevier. The first chair of the combined group was a Dutchman called Pierre Vinken, who hated books. I don't know whether he was hit on the head by a Bible as a young person, or I don't know, he hated books. And by that stage, my job was chief executive, Reed International Books. So it was only a matter of time before they decided they wanted to sell the books business. And I tried to help them and did my best. I tried to buy it myself, but they didn't want to sell me it. I raised 400 million. It was quite a lot of money. Anyway, they eventually broke it up and sold it in parts. The most important part went to Penguin Random House, or actually at the time, Random House, and it was a fantastic list of copyrights. Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Roddy Doyle, Irving Welsh, Sue Townsend, To Kill a Mockingbird, Neville Shute. I could go on forever. I think 4 or 5 Booker Prize winners in there. And that was really what got Random House and then Penguin Random House rolling. And if you look at their list, you'll see there's a lot of those old books. Anyway, obviously I didn't have a job anymore because we sold the business. So I went into business for a completely different thing, which was a startup. This is 1992 or 3. A startup called Current Science Group with a brilliant entrepreneurial Polish-Israeli friend of mine called Witek Tracz. And he was building the first social network for scientists. His business model, well, first of all, it was just all the money came from him. There were no outside shareholders. There was no family. It was just him. We didn't borrow anything from third parties, but we did have 200 staff and we had no income. So it was quite scary. But the model was that we'd build something that was so good, so irresistible, that other publishers would have to buy it from us at a huge premium, either because they wanted it or because they wanted to close it and eliminate competition. So we built something called BioMedNet, and after 2 years, we sold it to aforesaid Reed Elsevier. We bought it and promptly closed it because it was a challenge to their existing business model. Well, that's okay. They paid a premium, which allowed me to take a job at a company called Macmillan. Macmillan had been a family company owned by the Macmillan family, but they'd decided they wanted to sell, and they found another family in Stuttgart in Germany called von Holtzbrink family, Dieter von Holtzbrink. And the Holtzbrinks bought Macmillan, and I was their first CEO. after the purchase. I was summoned to Stuttgart to address the family and their advisors and to justify the price that they had paid, which was £450 million. And so they asked me to explain why it was worth £450 million. I said, well, you've got a great business here. You now own St. Martin's Press in America. You own Picador in London, Pan, Macmillan itself. And they're all worth lots of money. But much more importantly, you own a journal called Nature, which was the leading scientific journal in the world, which, in my opinion, if managed properly, could be worth at least 500 million, i.e. more than you paid for everything. And they all laughed and thought I was gone mad. Of course, later, Nature Publishing Group was merged with Springer Verlag, and the valuation was £2.5 billion. So I'd undercooked it, if anything. And Nature itself is a story of publishing, and I think it's relevant. When I joined, it was one magazine, Nature, and maybe two spin-offs, Nature Cell Biology and Nature Genetics. They didn't want to do any more spin-offs because they were worried that if they did lots of spin-offs, it would damage the main brand, Nature. Well, that's always a risk. We decide to go the other way. Say, well, look, if we do lots of new journals, they will actually embellish the original brand. Anyway, they now have 100 journals, or I don't know how many, with Nature. Every single one of them is the leader in its field, and Nature has never been stronger. However, back to my point, you sometimes have to fight to do what you think is right, and sometimes what you think is right is wrong. You know, that's also, in this case, thank God, it was right. And Macmillan was then broken up. The science went there, left the trade bit, the education, and African companies were closed. After I left, I did 10 years there, and the move leaving was generated by three factors. One was that I'd done 10 years, and a decade in a job seems to be quite a good time. Secondly, that I'd been grooming, if that's the right word, my successor, mentoring my successor, who was a woman who I was in her 40s, and I thought this was a job for 40-year-olds, not for 60-year-olds. Annette Thomas, and I wanted to hand over to her to give her a chance. And thirdly, we had repaid the whole 450 million that had been spent on us, so everything now was free. Post-tax 450 million. So I then joined Bloomsbury, next adventure. Bloomsbury is a trade publisher. It started as doing literary hardbacks in Britain, but by a series of by good fortune or brilliance, who knows, they landed on one author, originally one book, or the author was called J.K. Rowling, and the book was the first of the Harry Potter series, in which they had English rights excluding North America because they didn't think it was worth the extra $2,000, and various other things. But nonetheless, they had this brilliant thing. And I was quite aware of it because when I was at Macmillan, we ran the warehouse that distributed all those books. And I could see the number of people in the warehouse was going up and up and up. And I couldn't think why until digging a little bit deep, we found Harry Potter. And as a result of that, I was constantly in touch with the Bloomsbury people. And so we were very close. And incidentally, Bloomsbury still use Macmillan to this day worldwide for their distribution. But when I joined, they just published the 7th volume. There are no more. So, but they had a lot of cash. And so how do you reinvest? And Bloomsbury is a public company on the London Stock Exchange, has shareholders. You have to prove you're worth their investment. So we took a strategic decision that it was very unlikely we would find another Harry Potter. Given the first one had taken 500 years to appear, it was unlikely we'd find a second one or anything like it. And as we were a public company, we owed it to our shareholders to have a degree of stability. So we went on a buying spree of buying reliable, some might say boring, but I think exciting, non-trade publishing businesses. So the first one was A&C Black, which made most of its money out of publishing Who's Who and books about, say, yachts, and books about flowers and such like. And then we bought Methuen Drama, which was a pile of play scripts, effectively. And then we bought the Arden Shakespeare, which was the world's leading Shakespeare, and turned this, using digital technology, into something that's called Drama Online. If you look it up, you will find Drama Online is the world's leading resource for theatrical stuff, including videos, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the BBC, you name it. And in collaboration with other publishers, which is another message. You don't have to do everything yourself. We struck a deal with Faber, who are the second most important play publisher. And so we did that. We bought a company called Continuum, which was very big in religious publishing. We bought some legal publishing. Won't bore you, we bought hundreds of the bloody things, but pulled them together. And if you now look at the Bloomsbury results, you'll see a very significant part of their income comes from their academic and digital sales units, not their best-selling cookbooks and children's books and the rest of it. It's trying to create a balance between the fun and, when you get a hit, the huge success of a general book as against the reliability, the year-on-year cash and profit delivery of more specialist stuff. I'm conscious of the time. I'm very conscious of the time. So then, at the age of 70, I threw it all in. I still work for Bloomsbury on their Chinese operation, but I felt I couldn't stay on the board of a public company after 70. But I thought I'd get bored. So I started my own business called Mensch Publishing, which, if you can check it out on my website. I do some advisory stuff for other players, including a really interesting business which is digitizing the world's sheet music, aggregating it and selling it to conservatoires, universities, schools for use on iPads, etc. As that industry, the music industry, moves from print to digital. And an AI one, which I waved at Antonis, which is about using AI to market backlist titles successfully and cheaply. And I wrote my own book. So I'm rather busy. I'm off now. You're off to your next session. And I'm off to some other people who I can't name, who I'm advising on their publishing. It's the one thought I'd leave you with, if I may, is that this 50 years has been incredible fun. I don't look back on it as the good old years, because I think the next few years could be even better. I think the industry is incredibly exciting. Intellectual property, which is protected, thank God, by 70 years after the death of author copyright, which is a very big deal and should never be, we never forget that. But given that, and given the digital technology we have, and now AI coming to, I think, our help, you can be frightened of it, and there are reasons to be frightened of it, but you can embrace it. And my message would be, in all cases, it's better to embrace than do a runner. And I think you're going to have a wonderful career, and an MA or whatever it is in publishing, you may not go into publishing, but it will set you up for almost any other industry, because every industry is now a publisher, be it Marks and Spencer's or BMW or whatever. They all need the skill set, understanding rights, understanding design, understanding marketing, understanding intellectual property. So that's my spiel on the dots.
Very much, Richard. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. That was like a course on the history of publishing in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. We need another session for the Q&A and the discussion with the students.
I would be more than happy to come in one day and see you in person. It's I'm a great fan of UCL, so there you go.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
Great.
you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending Richard's talk. We will have a research seminar next week, and I will send information about it soon. There is now staff and student meeting in 10 minutes, so I will let you have a break and go to that meeting. Thank you very much, Richard. Bye, everyone.